Hello, is this now on? Okay, excellent. Well, good morning. And fortunately, I'm not the last person before lunch because that is the worst place in the world to be, other than just before cocktails. So, why open source powers the cloud? And what I want to talk about today, and I want to encourage this to be an interactive discussion. This dovetails very nicely with the presentation that we had just before the break, and maybe extends a little bit different, but I want to encourage discussion. Although if I start to see fruit or vegetables come out, I'm going to clamp down on it. So, 3 questions. 1, why did the number of US automakers drop by 90% between 1920 and 1940? And this all relates to cloud computing and open source. This isn't just a history lesson. What does that mean for cloud computing? And why is open source crucial to the future of cloud computing? And this really sort of takes off from the discussion around that we had about licensing and software and stuff like that, both from the perspective of cloud providers and from the perspective of applications and cloud users. Anyone recognize this guy? No, although that was a very astute guess. Any other guesses? R.E. Olds? You know, you're not very far off. If I had a fish, I'd throw it to you or something. That is Charles F. Duryea. And Charles F. Duryea founded the first automobile manufacturing company in America in 1897. And this is a picture of his car. And he was quite successful early on. But in fact, he was out of business by 1917. Now, many of you may recognize this next man. If I can get the slide to advance. Anyone recognize this fellow? This is Henry Ford. And this is a picture of something he put together, which is the Model T. The Model T was a very successful car. 1 point, 3/4 of all the cars in the world were Model Ts. And so we all know kind of Henry Ford and the Model T. What's interesting, though, is if you look at these 2 cars, they don't seem enormously different. I mean, there's clearly some differences. The Model T was a very good car when it was first designed, very successful. But you don't look at these 2 cars and say, gosh, they're so different that it's clear why the Model T became successful and this other one, the guy was out of business by 1917. However, allied with the Model T was the thing that actually drove Charles Duryea out of business. And this is what it is. This is a picture of the Ford River Rouge plant. This is the largest industrial plant ever constructed on the face of the planet. At its peak, 100,000 people worked here. 100,000 men, really, worked here. It's in the city of Dearborn. It was so, there were so many people working in it that the entire city of Dearborn adjusted everything around it. All of its roads, all of its public transport schedules, and so forth, just to handle this thing. In fact, it's still available, not available, it's still manufacturing cars today. It was first constructed in the late teens. And essentially what happened was Henry Ford relentlessly drove down the cost of manufacturing Model T between 1913 and 1920. 1913 is when he invented mass production. There's some controversy about whether he actually invented it, but that's when he first put together his assembly line, which we sort of assert. And unlike many people who might have said, I'm going to make them more efficiently but keep the cost up and increase my profits, he actually drove down the end price of the Model T. And he dropped the cost of manufacturing Model T by about 75% over the course of 7 years. And by 1920, its market share was 75%. And that's worldwide, not just in the United States. In the United States, it was probably a little higher, I would expect. And this had the result 1920, U.S. automakers were about 200 plus. I actually did some research on this, and I think this number may be conservative. It's amazing how many auto manufacturers there were in the United States. It's absolutely astonishing. But at least 200 existed in 1920. By 1940, there were 17. And by 2010, there were 3 car manufacturers. I'm talking about, not somebody who builds 10 cars, but somebody who builds some number of cars. And in fact, you might even say that there's really only 2 or 2.5 because Chrysler is now essentially owned by Fiat. What's an interesting factor about this is if you look at kind of the big 3 here in the center, that was a really good guess about Ransom-E. Olds. That was pretty astute. You're the first guess ever that when I presented this that came anywhere near close. Oh, okay, so like insider baseball here. So I can tell the phone call that'll be going home tonight. Hey, I talked to a guy came in. So the big 3, an interesting factor about our society, as the big 3 came to dominate and all of these other manufacturers disappeared, a very interesting factor happened in our economy, our society. A whole lot of other companies and sectors of our economy came into being as a result of cars becoming much cheaper. Essentially, all of these businesses came to make sense in a world of cheap, available personal transportation. Caterpillar, building roads, right? Stuff to build roads. Bechtel, one of the largest manufacturers of, or I should say construction companies in the world, building roads, airports, dams, et cetera, all based on this kind of stuff. Disneyland. Leisure essentially was created to a large extent by personal transportation. And certainly the notion of a remote resort that wasn't located inside of a city limits or something like that exists only because of automobile transportation. Kaufman and Broad, I think it's the way it's pronounced, it's a home builder, basically suburbs. Weren't totally created by the automobile because there were in the early 20th century and maybe even the late 19th century, the concept of trolley suburbs, which they had there that surrounded larger cities. But the kind of notion of Levittown or San Ramon here or something like that only came into being because of automobiles. Holiday Inn, I don't have a picture of McDonald's, and I should here, but Holiday Inn and McDonald's, people started traveling a lot more, and they needed the opportunity to have a known entity when they went to this new place as a result of this personal transportation, where they would know what the quality was, where they would know what it was like. Previously, you pretty much stuck around a city or something like that, and you knew the hotels that were there. But now if you're going 200 miles away, 500 miles away, it was like, I want to stay in a place, and I don't know any of the places around here. Oh, Holiday Inn, I know what that is. The whole franchise business built around personal transportation. And Penske is a former race car driver who now has car dealerships. They manage fleets for companies and stuff like that. Again, all based on the fact that we have large numbers of automobiles and so forth. So essentially, because the cost of transportation, the cost of moving someone from one place to another dropped so much, all of these complementary things came into being. And we could call these complementary things businesses. But if we look at a different way of examining this, we can think of them as being applications. This is the River Rouge plant of the 21st century of the information age, or one of them. Anybody recognize what this is? It's not Ransom-E. Olds' place, or it's not a factory. It's an information age factory. This is a new Microsoft data center located outside of Chicago. It's 700,000 square feet. It contains 400,000 servers. This is the River Rouge plant of the 21st century. Interestingly, though, unlike the River Rouge plant in Detroit that had 100,000 people working in it, this plant total has 40 people working in it. Now, they do their knock work off-site from this, but there are still only 40 people that run this entire thing, and that includes the security guards and everything. The scale and cost reductions of these kinds of offerings are just astonishing, absolutely phenomenal. And they use this to support their email offering and I believe some of their other apps around what they call live, so SharePoint and so forth. I could as easily have a picture here of a Google data center or an Amazon data center, one of the new Apple data centers. Essentially, they're all moving to these very large, very centralized, very scale-oriented, very cheap ways of delivering computing. And what does this mean for a typical organization, a typical IT consumer? So Bechtel, going back to them, said, let's figure out what it costs us to do different kinds of IT stuff versus what it costs leading providers. So this would be the analogy of how much does it cost us to manufacture a car versus Ford or GM. What they found was they were anywhere from 4 to 40 or maybe even 100 times more expensive to do the same task as one of the cloud providers. So they looked at bandwidth. They figured they paid on a monthly basis $500 for megabit capacity. They did some back engineering or backward calculation, figured that YouTube must have been paying about $10 to $15 per megabit of capacity. Sysadmin ratio, they figured they had about 100 servers per admin. And that's not bad. In our research, we found numbers anywhere from 30 to 200 typical. Google, they said 17,000 servers. If you look at that Microsoft, it's actually significantly higher than that. Storage, they figured they pay about $375 a gig per month. And of course, Amazon at that time was 10 cents a gig per month. I think they may have dropped their price now, and certainly it's cheaper as you get to larger amounts. So what they concluded was they were really not economically viable on a benchmark basis against the best of breed. Now, Bechtel was large enough that they started to do stuff and say, well, how can we address that? And they've adopted many of the practices around this. So for example, they bought fiber to run their own bandwidth out to peering points so they could get onto the internet and drop their bandwidth costs. Bechtel's large enough to do that. They're a very large corporation. The typical company does not have that kind of capability, does not have that option. This is just an example of a cloud user and kind of the experience they have using their internal capacity versus somebody else's. TC3 is they do healthcare claim analysis for companies. So kind of the equivalent of send in your healthcare claims, we'll analyze them, and we'll tell you that you're getting ripped off kind of thing. And they were doing about a million of these every day. And then someone said, let's respond to a changed business condition. We have a new offering. Let's have a new thing. And they said, why don't we let people submit historical ones? You know, because they've got a lot in the backdrop. We could probably do the same kind of analysis. Save them money, help our business. By the way, TC3 is about a $30 million a year business, so not a very large business. And they hit a home run, which is basically their load went from 1 million a day to 100 million a day. Stephen, what time did I start? Is Stephen in the room? It tells you how much he thought the presentation was going to be, or how good it was, huh? Well, I want to respect time, so I want to be sure. So, this. 30 more minutes, okay. So they did some analysis, and their CIO came back and said, well, it's going to cost us about $750,000 for new hardware for this, plus about $30,000 a month for maintenance and hosting and so forth. If you're a $30 million a year business and you come in and say, I need about $750,000 to kind of, handle this, you get questioned pretty closely, particularly given that they weren't sure if that new 100 million submissions per day was going to last or if it was going to be like sort of a burst, and then it would settle down to maybe 2 million a day. So it's sort of they were trying to figure out what to do there, and essentially the old way was making a big bet. Instead, they went to Amazon and used Amazon Web Services. It cost them $600 a month to use S3 to support this. I apologize for not having a GoGrid example as dramatic as this. But essentially, for those of you who did not bring your calculators, they're saving about 98% per month on this by being able to leverage Amazon's storage as opposed to the traditional model, which would be buying and using their own. So what lessons does River Rouge teach for us around cloud computing? One is providers require scale to be competitive. Essentially, when you move to this model of kind of craft, which is where IT has been historically, to mass production, it becomes a scale, cost of capital kind of business. And providers need to move to that model. And certainly we've seen Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Apple, all of these folks doing it. And, you know, I would speculate they're dropping the cost of this stuff at least 75%, if not more, compared to a typical user of IT. And to be competitive, they have to do it. If you want to be a cloud provider, essentially you've got to be able to match those kinds of cost structures. Users will shift from being providers. You know, we think the long-term shift is that mostly people will become users of IT. They will not become their own providers. They will not be saying, yeah, you know, part of our business is we've got to have our own data centers. We've got to have our own servers. We've got to have our own network. That's going to become kind of a, why are we doing this? Why are we using our capital, which don't have that much capital in a corporation? We have to figure out where to invest it. Why are we investing it in stuff that in essence doesn't differentiate us? No one ever says, the reason I use Marriott, the reason I use GE is because, man, they know how to really run great data centers. No, they use them because they know how to construct aircraft engines or they have a great lodging experience. And so those companies are going to say, why are we being a provider? We should be a user of IT. What's the best way to be efficient around that? And associated with this, we firmly believe this long-term, the scope and scale of applications is going to explode. We're already seeing this around this notion of big data. I'm sure, how many people here are familiar with that term, big data? A few. Essentially, the argument, you know, the scale of data within most corporations is absolutely exploding to the point that, you know, it's a great time to be a drive manufacturer or a storage vendor, but the scope and scale of applications will explode. Just as those examples I used around Holiday Inn and Penske, Bechtel, Kaufman and Brood, all of those folks, all of those businesses made sense in a world of cheap transportation. We will start to see a set of applications, the kinds, availability, the ways we use IT explode when the cost of delivering applications drops. And I don't think we've even begun to understand what that's going to be like or the scope or scale of this. But essentially our entire economy, the entire way we live is becoming IT infused. In the last session we talked about the iTunes thing and music and so forth. I mean, we're moving to a world where music is everywhere. It's consumable on demand. We can have it any way we want. We have this stuff. That's all IT, essentially, right? It's all bits. It's IT. And so the scope and scale of applications is going to explode. And as I just said, IT will infuse every dimension of life. We're going to see it in entertainment. We're going to see it in our healthcare. We're going to see it in education, which is extremely ripe for technology disruption. I have twin 10-year-old sons. And you take them to school, and it's like they're stepping back into the 19th century. You know, and education essentially bolts technology onto that. It's ripe for being transformed by technology. Every dimension of life is going to become infused by IT, which is going to make the kinds of applications we have explode. And, you know, essentially our computing past is a poor predictor of our computing future. Our belief, what we work with our clients, what we preach, is that we're moving from that world where we had 200 plus auto manufacturers, all of them very inefficient, all of them high cost, the ability to adopt personal transportation, very difficult for most people. We're moving to a world where we're going to have not very many providers, but the ability to use that for the end user is going to explode. So looking back at how expensive it is to run IT or how difficult it is to have apps, don't imagine that's the way the future will be. The future is going to be much more like, you know, I can find Starbucks is, you know, you can find a Starbucks anywhere because of this world. That's what our app world is going to look like. What about software? And we touched on this in the last session. So if you sort of say, well, the world's going to change a lot in terms of IT. IT is going to infuse everything. We're going to have zillions and zillions of applications. What is our software world going to look like? And it's ripe for a revolution. So provider software, you know, basically these cloud providers need software to support their ability. This is all essentially based on virtualization, right? They need software, and I'm talking about to build their cloud. They need it to be highly scalable, right? It has to be something that can be easily expanded, that can support these kinds of, 400,000 servers. It has to be extremely cost effective. In our opinion, if you're a successful cloud provider, having to write a check for every server that you add to your grid, add to your compute clusters, is just cost prohibitive in this world that's becoming a world of scale and margin. So you've got to figure out a way to be extremely cost effective. You've got to be able to enable flexibility and I'm going to say enable differentiation at the business level. And Paul sort of touched on this when he said, if you're someone who says, yes, I'm taking a commercial product and providing a cloud based on it, it's really difficult to differentiate around that because you're essentially kind of taking the same technology and presenting it to the world. Now you can differentiate around, we serve the Great Lakes region really, really well, and we know that. Or we have the most attractive sales reps, and people enjoy engaging with them more than they like other ones. But in terms of the cloud offering, I think it's really difficult to differentiate because it's essentially a kind of a commonality. It's a common application that you're presenting to the world. And that's really hard if you're a cloud provider. Hey, wait a minute. There's only one person talking, and it's me. Not that.
That's technology infusing our lives.
I am ready for it to stop infusing right now for the next half an hour at least. So, so these cloud providers need to be able to differentiate. And that's very difficult when you're providing a kind of a standardized offering, which is what you do if you're providing, just taking someone else's software and bits and presenting them to the world. From a user perspective, again, you need to be highly scalable, right? If you're running these very large apps or have huge amounts of data, your apps have to be very scalable as well. And again, that's a challenge if every time your business improves, you need to go write a check to someone to support that. Very, very difficult, particularly a high-price check. You need unencumbered licensing. We talked about this quite a bit in the last session, both around the OVF stuff, where, as Simon pointed out, that a lot of the software application providers, their licensing does not support this model of, well, I've got it inside my data center, now I want to run it somewhere else. Wait a second, it doesn't support that. But also the notion of, I need licensing that supports the kind of business offerings that I want to build that are highly scalable, that infuse every part of my life. I can't afford to write a large check per server. That made sense in this world where we had very few servers or very small, very contained applications. In a world where we have maybe applications built on hundreds of servers or thousands of servers, that's really, really challenging. And I don't need to go into it in detail, but if you sort of accept that part and parcel of this world is very, so-called elasticity, elastic applications, where they go up and down in terms of stuff like that, you need software licenses to support that. And a software licensing regimen that says, well, figure out what your largest potential amount of usage is going to be, and then pay that for your license. Even if your load 90% of the time is only a tenth of that, that's economically unviable. And so you need unencumbered licensing. Or a better way to say it is licensing that aligns with this kind of a world. You need to enable flexibility in the way that you use your applications, your application software. You need to enable agility, which is I need to respond very quickly. So I have a new business offering. I can't afford to have to go into a licensing negotiation with my vendor because now I want to increase the number of licenses I've got. I want to be able to respond now. And I need to be able to differentiate at the application level. So from the perspective of a user, whatever hypervisor is underneath doesn't really make that much difference because they're not differentiating on the fact that, oh yeah, we run on X hypervisor versus Y. What differentiates it for an application user, for a business is, what do I do with my applications? How does this help me build different jet engines or do different kinds of hospitality? And so I need software that enables me to differentiate at that level, which means I have to be able to modify that software, extend it, change it, add stuff to it. The realities around proprietary software, and I've sort of touched on this, the licenses are not agile or flexible, right? They are designed for a world that, how many servers are you going to have? Define that up front. Let's negotiate this kind of a thing. Wait, you need to double that overnight and then reduce it again? Well, our licenses don't support that. So they're not flexible. They're not elastic. And they really aren't very useful in a world where I don't even know next week what software I'm going to want to use. And I'll just make a comment that I think this is going to be one of the big challenges for cloud computing going forward in that, and I think Simon may have touched on this, a lot of software providers, their initial, they all recognize this world's coming, but their initial response is, how do I keep my current financials looking good? I can't afford to just jump to this world and change all my pricing if that means my revenues next quarter are going to dump 30% and my stock's going to go to the toilet. All of the thinking is, if I respond to this world, how can I do that in a way that really keeps my numbers up, keeps my stock price up, and so forth? That's the reality. And so I think it's very difficult for them to respond, and I think it's going to be a long, drawn-out kind of thing. We're going to see a whole new range of software providers come forward who are more amenable to this. They're focused on the old way. I don't want to I just sort of said that. One of the things that really strikes me is that innovation has very much moved into open source. If you look at all the big data stuff, all these new offerings are just open source. Cassandra, Voldemort, all those things, the innovation around those kinds of things is happening in open source. And I think that's increasingly going to be the case. It used to be the criticism of open source was basically it was building Skodas, was that the Czech car in the past? Basically knockoffs of the real stuff. That was what they always had in the Soviet bloc, was cheap imitations of the Western things. It's not happening that way now. Innovation is really starting off as open source licensed, I think, to a very large extent. And I think we'll continue to see a lot of that. Open source enables cloud providers. We had a presentation from GoGrid. Certainly Amazon is the poster child for that. Many of these cloud providers are using that. And interestingly, even VMware, which is proprietary and basing its stuff on the cloud, bought SpringSource to provide stuff. So they're jumping on the open source bandwagon as well around that. Cloud providers, can really leverage open source to help their offerings to get the right kind of cost structure they need for this new world of scale and margin compression. And then open source enables cloud users as well. If you're going to build an application that you're not sure what's going to happen to it a week from now, a month from now, you need a software product that supports that, aligns with that. To me, that cries out for open source. I think it's much more difficult to try and build that and build a business case around a licensing scheme that doesn't support it. So, in terms of conclusions, well, learn from history. There's lots of examples of industries that have gone from sort of not very scalable, hand-done, high marginal cost, high profitability to mass production, lower cost, scale kind of thing. So we should learn from that. It's very interesting. I talked to many people in technology, and for some reason, there seems to be a perception that the software industry is somehow sui generis. It's different than everything else. It'll never go through this. And I don't really understand that. I cannot see any reason why software is any different from any other industry that goes through a period of initial incredible innovation that with profits can be harvested at it and eventually settles down and becomes a much more mass kind of business. History teaches economic scale in scalable industries, and for sure, running data centers is a scalable industry. I don't see how anyone can disagree or argue with that, but certainly the evidence is there in terms of what these big providers are doing. And that presumes, or implies, I should say, that implies that if you're running a data center, you have to figure out a way to match those kinds of scale economies, or else you'll become one of the 200 manufacturers that didn't make the cut to become one of the 17 that didn't make the cut to become one of the 3. Cloud computing will transform the face of what we consider computing. You know, that whole thing about whatever that was, that thing that started talking, that was infusing our life just a couple of minutes ago, that will become common in every dimension of our lives. I mean, we haven't even begun to think about it. It's going to transform the way we do computing, what we consider computing. And open source will be a critical and vital enabler of cloud computing, both for the providers and for the consumers. And I think that's my last bullet point. Nope, the next 20 years will be fun and hard. We haven't seen anything yet. So, with that, comments, questions? Yes.
So let's go back to the lessons in ECP.
Yep.
Doesn't supply and demand determine pricing? And isn't the lesson that there's no demand and that's why the price is low?
There's no demand unless the price is right?
And no, there's no demand and that's why the price is low. In other words, they should be charging more.
Well, the prices are actually quite high. I mean, relative to your own internal cost of running the same stuff, see that the VM running in two flat out 24/7, it's actually cheaper to own a server and run it.
No, but
What's
my
the
question
point
is
is
the
that there is not enough competition and that the price is not sufficient for other people to drop substantially as price competition rises.
Right, but what is the demand on your infrastructure at the moment? If there's no demand, that would drive the price down.
Oh, right. Prices are not being driven down. I mean, they are, I mean, from everything I know, and this is all this public, about $150 million business right now. It's set to quadruple within the next 2 years.
And how much of this is just testing the market then, where they're prepared to go with a loss leader just to get into the game?
They're making money. $150 million business.
It's every $200 to $700 million today.
Okay.
So, I mean, they're making money. I think it's interesting to question where margin comes in general in the future. If a bunch of other folks go for commoditized pricing for those kind of services, where do margin-rich services come from? I think that there's an interesting category there of folks who do stuff which is different than the EC2 style model, which in my view is merely good. It's kind of really done better, but a whole bunch of other cool things behind it. But the computation model is pretty British, right? And so people will do other cool things too, which are richer and give them margin. And that's important to establish.
Yes, just to do that, Amazon right now is making pretty good margin on their stuff. The question is, as other people enter that and offer sort of similar services that are willing to be the Henry Fords, you know, will those prices come down and the margins get compressed? And I expect that will be the case, because this is a scale and margin business.
But they do not want that. I mean, if you look at Amazon's implementation of MySQL, one API call gets you a terabyte MySQL database, completely backed up with 15-day window, second-level granularity for transactions, roll forward, roll back, and you pay for compute and storage. You don't pay for that. So why would you ever run MySQL yourself?
I'm not arguing with that. I'm just saying, why wouldn't they put up their prices? I mean, if Amazon saw your presentation,
Yeah.
I mean, one takeaway for them would be, damn, I'm not charging enough. How can I charge more? Because there seems to be a lot of money there sitting on the table
Right.
to be taken, and the question is why they're not taking it.
Well,
Why are they writing
so
Wait, their pricing is about the same right now as running a server yourself. So clearly, if they put it up to substantially more than that, people would buy more servers themselves, right? I mean,
not from this lesson.
not really. I mean, you know, I think people are pretty rational about that stuff. They look at it and say, well, if I leave this VM on 24/7 Amazon, it's going to cost me about
Developers are taking the infrastructure for enterprises to uptake it more than 4 years. And developers are not going to pay a lot more than what they're doing already.
If Steve were here to rein this in, I think he would. I think this is all great discussion, but probably good for a break, and we should concentrate on questions for our speakers.
I will say that Amazon has seen this, and I happen to know that they anticipate other people are going to come in there, and they've engineered their stuff so they can drop their prices and still do that. And they sort of, in a way, are embracing this because, in their view, they sort of think of themselves as being like Dell was in 1995, which is kind of, you know, we can still make a lot of money being a lot cheaper than the other guys because they have a much higher cost structure. So I want to call to you, but there was another hand in the back?
So the car industry analogy, there's a huge network of sales and service, for the car industry,
Yeah,
and that's why it scales.
yeah.
Maintenance, support, service, scale. There's a huge network out there, completely decentralized, and everybody actually makes money with public growth. What do you see that's same analogy going in the cloud computing?
If you couldn't hear, the statement was there's a huge ecosystem around that. Not only the kinds of companies I identified, but I'm assuming you're talking about sort of gas stations or auto repair or dealers and so forth.
Support, sales, and service, and everything else.
Right.
What's the corresponding analogy on the
Okay. Well, one thing would be software as a service vendors that are going to leverage these kinds of things, so they'll be providing that. Kind of the equivalent will be service providers sitting around that, integrators, VARs, consulting companies that help around that kind of stuff. Consultants who sort of help you figure out which cloud provider should I be using, or how do I design my app, or stuff like that. That's our view of the value. Essentially, and I think Simon was quite right on this, we refer to this kind of phenomena as the migration of margin. Margin is going to move away from I sell you a server and I make money on that to the server is essentially kind of dirt cheap, the compute service, and somebody else figures out I deliver you a service, and that's where the margin is. That's where Penske makes all their money, for example. So being a car manufacturer has, for a lot of car manufacturers, not been that successful recently over the last few years. Penske makes a ton of money because what they sell companies is not I'm going to sell you a truck. They say I'm going to sell you a fleet service around that truck that'll make sure that it's maintained and blah 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 blah. That's the kind of thing that we'll see in the cloud computing stuff. Simon, you've already had.
To be clear, they already make their own servers. So if you compare that with the cost of buying a Dell server, there's already substantial margin just in reselling the server that they made out of bin 4 parts that they got from Intel.
That's right. I mean, they have Amazon's been doing a big roadshow called Amazon in the AWS and the Enterprise, and Werner Vogels gets up and talks about this. And part of their pitch is basically we buy in volume, we get a lot cheaper than anybody else can, and they also have their stuff custom designed so they don't have USB ports and stuff like that. Yeah.
I like the approach to analogy to a completely different industry, but I'm worried that the correct industry might not be the auto industry, but the financial industry. The last couple of years, the world has learned that if you push very complex things farther and farther away from the people that are using them, that everybody assumes that everything is going to work out wonderfully. Some people end up making billions of dollars, and everybody else suffers. Do you see anything like that happening in the cloud provider space?
I'll bet you're fun at cocktail parties. I'm trying to wrap my head around, sort of what would be like a derivative, or kind of the equivalent of these kind of phony mortgages around cloud computing. And I'm going to have.
Pushing data into the cloud, security issues is probably a good one.
I could come up with one as well, where it's completely transparent to the customer how, what sort of priority or any kind of like, how the system is tuned and how many virtual machines are on the host
Yeah.
they're on, how big is that, and so there's a possibility that what would probably be closer to like a derivative where people just think I put my money in this Madoff thing and isn't give it back. If you find that you're having to upgrade because the cloud provider is having to lower the bar of what they provide you to hit their bottom line,
Yeah.
which they could do for a month and just kind of suck it in. And I would not be surprised by that happening, especially at smaller companies, because sometimes you don't have the capital and you certainly don't want to turn new customers away. And if you can just get through that 3 months of poor performance damaging your reputation, then you can just come out and say, oh, we were having a problem with the Linux kernel and we fixed it,
Yeah.
which
I'd blame the
totally,
Linux kernel
this
too.
is not made up, sort of thing. So, that's what I think what the analogy would be, is that then you end up having to upgrade to get back to what you paid for last month.
Someone might adulterate their offering, essentially,
Yeah.
and sort of, yeah. I guess that's a fair thing, and I hope that there'll be enough competition that, sort of if one of them is screwing up, you'll use another one. Security is kind of a very interesting topic around that, and for sure is an issue. And of course, we work a lot with companies and sort of say, absolutely that should be a concern about your cloud provider. Now, how do you do on security? And most companies don't really do that well. Is this the hook? Are we out of time? Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Is branding of cloud services interoperability? Like with Amazon Machine Images, are they being used at other providers very effectively, or the EC2 API with Eucalyptus or something?
Well, the images are not portable, and we touched on that last session with the OVF stuff and kind of, it's not the case that they are portable at this point. Could be maybe in the future. The EC2 APIs have in a way become a de facto standard. So for example, Eucalyptus, which is a project to essentially, it supports the EC2, or the AWS, I should say, APIs. So you can take an app and use the same APIs within Eucalyptus. But it's the time when standardization really starts to make sense is when you've wrung the innovation out of stuff. And I don't think we're there yet with cloud computing. I think we're really early days. So, when we get asked that question, I typically say, probably a little early to be worried about that. You should be the question you should be saying is, how much benefit do I get from using a cloud thing versus what I'm doing today, rather than, am I going to be able to move from one cloud provider to another one? That's a kind of second order question. Okay,
Yeah,
I think we're done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.